What happens when the colonized finally rise up against their oppressors? Frantz Fanon, psychiatrist, revolutionary, and one of the most influential voices of anti-colonial thought, argues that the answer is not found in compromise, negotiation, or gradual reform, but in violence. His book, The Wretched of the Earth, captures the fire, trauma, and hope of decolonization, not as an abstract theory, but as lived experience. Background of the book. Published in 1961, on the eve of Fanon's death from leukemia, The Wretched of the Earth became a manifesto for anti-colonial movements worldwide. Written against the backdrop of the Algerian War of Independence, 1954 to 1962, the book examines both the brutality of colonial rule and the psychological, cultural, and political processes of liberation. Jean-Paul Sartre's famous preface sets the tone, calling European readers to confront their own complicity in colonial violence. But the core of the text is Fanon's searing analysis of how colonialism dehumanizes both colonized and colonizer, and how the struggle for liberation reshapes societies. The book's 5 chapters move from the raw violence of decolonization, Chapter 1, to questions of political organization, the dangers of new elites, the role of culture, and the psychological scars left by war. Each chapter builds upon the last, tracing both the possibilities and pitfalls of national independence. Chapter 1, On Violence. Detailed summary. This first chapter is Fanon's most famous and controversial. It begins with a stark claim. Decolonization is always a violent process. Violence as the essence of colonialism. Fanon argues that colonialism itself is born of violence. Military conquest, occupation, and domination. It does not persuade the colonized of its legitimacy. It imposes itself by force. The colonial world is a Manichaean world split in two, settlers in their wealthy, secure zones, and the native population confined to poverty and surveillance. This division is maintained through constant force. The logic of violent liberation. Because colonialism is violence, its undoing cannot come from polite appeals or negotiations. Decolonization, Fanon insists, is always a violent event, because it overturns the entire structure of domination. For the colonized, violence becomes both a weapon and a cleansing force. It shatters fear, restores dignity, and reasserts humanity. Psychological dimensions. Fanon, as a psychiatrist, highlights how colonial violence destroys the self-worth of the colonized, instilling inferiority and passivity. Revolutionary violence, in contrast, reverses this. It enables the colonized to overcome their internalized oppression, uniting them as a people. Violence, therefore, is not just political, but existential. It is the process by which the colonized become subjects of history again. Fanon departs from Marxist orthodoxy by arguing that the urban working class in colonized nations often remains tied to the colonial system through wages, unions, and city life. Instead, he sees the rural peasantry as the true revolutionary force. Living outside the colonial economy, peasants are less compromised and more prepared to wage guerrilla war. International dimensions. Fanon situates local struggles within a global framework. Colonialism is tied to imperialist capitalism, and national liberation struggles form part of a worldwide revolutionary wave. He warns that colonial powers may try to suppress these revolutions brutally, but also predicts that liberation movements will inspire solidarity across continents. Cleansing and creation. Finally, Fanon describes violence not as pure destruction, but as a generative act. By overthrowing the colonial order, it creates the conditions for a new society. Decolonization is not reformist, but transformative. It replaces one species of men with another. Chapter 1 ends by establishing violence as the foundation of decolonization, but Fanon also hints at its limits. If violence unites and mobilizes, it cannot by itself guarantee a stable future. Once the colonizers are expelled, what comes next? This question opens the way to Chapter 2, Spontaneity, its strength and weakness. Here, Fanon shifts focus from the moment of uprising to the challenges of revolutionary organization. He examines how spontaneous revolts erupt among the colonized, the strengths of this raw energy, but also the dangers if it is not guided by political leadership and long-term strategy. In other words, if Chapter 1 is about the explosive birth of liberation, Chapter 2 is about how to sustain it and give it direction. Chapter 2, Spontaneity, its strength and weakness. Detailed summary. After After making the case in Chapter 1 that violence is the engine of decolonization, Fanon turns in Chapter 2 to ask, what happens after the first spark of revolt? He acknowledges the immense power of spontaneous uprisings, but stresses that without organization, revolutionary energy can burn out or be manipulated. 1. The spark of spontaneous revolt. Fanon describes how colonial subjects, often in rural areas, reach a breaking point and erupt in spontaneous acts of resistance, riots, attacks, guerrilla ambushes. This spontaneity is driven by lived oppression, hunger, humiliation, land dispossession, and everyday police brutality. Such outbursts are powerful because they are authentic. They come directly from the people, not from elite debates or external ideologies. The strength of spontaneity. Moral power. Spontaneous revolts show that the colonized refuse to accept domination passively. They are proof of dignity reclaimed. Unity through action. Even without clear leadership, these uprisings bring together peasants, tribes, and marginalized groups in shared struggle. Shock to colonial authority. They destabilize the colonizers, who often underestimate the colonized masses. 3. The limits and dangers. But Fanon is clear, spontaneity alone cannot carry the revolution. Lack of coordination. Unplanned revolts often lack strategy, making them vulnerable to brutal repression. Romanticization of revolt. While inspiring, raw violence without structure risks creating cycles of bloodshed without transformation. Fragmentation. Tribal, ethnic, or regional divisions can reappear if there is no unifying vision. Urban-rural disconnect. The peasantry may lead spontaneous revolts, but without linking to other social classes, workers, intellectuals, the movement risks isolation. The role of political organization. Fanon insists that revolutions cannot succeed on spontaneity alone. They require conscious leadership that can transform spontaneous anger into sustained strategy, nationalist parties and movements that channel revolt into coordinated campaigns against the colonial power, education and political training so that people not only fight, but also understand the goals of liberation. Here, Fanon makes a sharp critique. Nationalist parties often begin in urban centers and may initially dismiss or misunderstand the peasantry. Yet, he argues, they must root themselves in the rural masses if the revolution is to succeed. 5. Transition to the next problem. The chapter closes with a crucial tension. The revolutionary energy of the masses must be guided, but not suffocated by leadership. Leaders who underestimate spontaneity risk alienating the people, while revolts without direction risk collapse. This sets the stage for Chapter 3, the trials and tribulations of national consciousness. Having shown how revolutionary movements emerge and need structure, Fanon now turns to the post-independence phase, when new national elites rise to power. He warns that unless guided by genuine revolutionary commitment, these elites can betray the masses, replacing colonial masters without dismantling colonial structures. In short, Chapter 1, violence is the birth of decolonization. Chapter 2, spontaneity sparks revolt, but without organization, liberation falters. Chapter 3, the new national consciousness must avoid corruption, elitism, and mimicry of colonial systems. Chapter 3, the trials and tribulations of national consciousness. Detailed summary. Having explored the role of violence, Chapter 1, and spontaneity, Chapter 2, Fanon now asks a pressing question. What happens after independence is achieved? This chapter is one of the sharpest critiques in The Wretched of the Earth, aimed not at colonizers, but at the new national elites who emerge in post-colonial societies. 1. The rise of the national bourgeoisie. Fanon warns that the urban middle class, often educated under colonial systems, is quick to assume leadership after independence. This class aspires to replace the colonizers at the top, but rarely seeks to fundamentally transform the colonial system. Rather than building a new economic and political order, they often focus on privileges, wealth, and status, acting as intermediaries for foreign powers. 2. The betrayal of the masses. Instead of redistributing land or resources, the new elite frequently exploits the same peasants and workers who carried the revolution. They embrace nationalism as rhetoric, but lack a true revolutionary program. Their nationalism becomes hollow, more about flags and anthems than structural change. Fanon calls this the pitfall of national consciousness, a shallow independence where only the rulers change, but the system remains. 3. Neocolonial dependency. Economically, Fanon argues, many new states risk falling into neocolonialism. They remain dependent on former colonial powers or international capital. The new elites prefer importing goods, copying Western models, and seeking foreign approval rather than investing in genuine self-sufficiency. As a result, the promised liberation risks becoming a new form of subjugation. 4. The role of the people. True independence, Fanon insists, can only come if the people remain at the center of politics. Peasants and workers must not be demobilized after independence. Instead, they should be active participants in building the new nation. Without mass involvement, politics becomes elitist, alienated, and corrupt. 5. A call for revolutionary leadership. Fanon does not dismiss the idea of national leadership, but he calls for leaders who are rooted in the people rather than detached elites. Leaders must promote social justice, economic redistribution, education, and culture, not just replace colonizers in government offices. Only by transforming society at its foundations can national consciousness become a liberating force instead of an empty slogan. Transition to Chapter 4. This critique of shallow nationalism naturally leads into Chapter 4, on national culture. Having shown the dangers of elites clinging to power, Fanon turns to culture as a battlefield. He argues that true liberation requires reclaiming and reshaping culture, not just politics, since colonialism had attacked the very identity of colonized peoples. Flow of the argument so far. Chapter 1. Violence is the necessary birth of decolonization. Chapter 2. Spontaneity sparks revolt but needs organization. Chapter 3. Post-independence elites risk betraying the revolution unless the masses remain central. If you found these insights eye-opening, remember, Fanon's words are not just history, they're a lens for understanding today's struggles across Africa and the world. To keep learning about African history, politics, and culture in simple, powerful ways, make sure you subscribe to AfriFacts on YouTube. Join the community, share knowledge, and let's continue building the conversations Fanon started. Chapter 4, on national culture. Detailed summary. After dissecting the dangers of post-independence elitism in Chapter 3, Fanon now shifts to another front in the struggle, culture. He argues that the fight against colonialism is not just political or economic, it is also cultural, because colonial domination works by distorting and destroying the colonized people's identity. 1. The colonial attack on culture. Fanon begins by showing how colonial powers denigrate indigenous cultures, portraying them as primitive, stagnant, or even non-existent. Colonizers claim they bring civilization, suggesting that without them, colonized people have no real history or culture. This is not just propaganda, it is a strategy to justify domination by convincing the colonized of their own inferiority. 2. The pitfall of romanticizing the past. In response, colonized intellectuals often react by romanticizing pre-colonial culture, idealizing ancient kingdoms, traditions, and spiritual practices. While this can restore pride, Fanon warns it risks becoming a form of nostalgia that does not address the present or the future. Simply glorifying the past does not automatically create liberation. Culture must be living and dynamic, not a museum piece. 3. Culture as resistance. Fanon emphasizes that true national culture is born in struggle. It is not just in poetry, art, or folklore, but in the act of resisting colonialism that a people reclaim themselves. He writes that it is through fighting for liberation that culture becomes a revolutionary force, because resistance reawakens collective dignity, creativity, and solidarity. 4. The role of intellectuals. Colonized intellectuals face a critical task. They must not isolate themselves in universities or literary circles. Instead, they should connect their work to the real struggles of the people. Literature, art, and philosophy should serve the revolution by articulating the aspirations of the masses and creating a vision of a new society. 5. International dimensions. Fanon also situates cultural struggle globally. As colonized peoples resist, they contribute to a broader human liberation project. National cultures do not close themselves off. Instead, they enrich a universal human culture that is freed from colonial domination. 6. Transition to Chapter 5. This chapter emphasizes that politics and culture are inseparable in the struggle for liberation. Fanon insists that culture is not folklore, but resistance made visible. With this foundation laid, he turns in Chapter 5, Colonial War and Mental Disorders, to the psychological dimension of decolonization. Here, as a psychiatrist, he documents the devastating mental health effects of colonial violence on both colonized and colonizer, and the ways war reshapes the psyche. Flow of the argument so far. Chapter 1, Violence is the inevitable birth of decolonization. Chapter 2, Spontaneity must be transformed into organized struggle. Chapter 3, National consciousness risks corruption if elites betray the masses. Chapter 4, True national culture is not nostalgia, but resistance in action. Fanon reminds us that reclaiming culture is as revolutionary as reclaiming land. If you want to keep exploring Africa's cultural resilience and revolutionary history, subscribe to AfriFacts on YouTube. It's where stories of African identity, resistance, and pride are kept alive and shared with the world. Chapter 5, Colonial War and Mental Disorders. Detailed summary. Unlike the earlier chapters, which focus on political, social, and cultural structures, Chapter 5 takes a more intimate turn. Here Fanon, drawing on his work as a psychiatrist in Algeria during the War of Independence, explores the deep psychological scars of colonial violence. This chapter is unique because it blends political theory with case studies, showing how colonialism literally inhabits the minds and bodies of both colonizer and colonized. 1. Colonialism as psychological violence. Fanon argues that colonialism is not just economic exploitation or cultural domination, it is also psychological warfare. The constant experience of humiliation, surveillance, torture, and discrimination produces trauma, anxiety, and internalized inferiority in the colonized. This explains why decolonization is not only about political liberation, but also about healing minds and souls. 2. War and the mind. Fanon presents case studies from his psychiatric practice during the Algerian War. He describes patients suffering from nightmares, paranoia, depression, violent outbursts, and psychosomatic illnesses, all direct consequences of war and repression. He shows how both colonized fighters and civilians, even children, develop psychological wounds that linger long after the battle's end. 3. Trauma of the colonizers. Interestingly, Fanon also notes the psychological effects on colonizers. French soldiers, torturers, and settlers themselves suffered mental breakdowns, guilt, and disorders resulting from their participation in or exposure to systemic violence. This underscores Fanon's claim from Chapter 1, violence dehumanizes both oppressor and oppressed. 4. Case studies as testimonies. Fanon provides detailed patient stories of Algerians tortured until they became mute, of fighters traumatized by their own acts of violence, of children manifesting war traumas through stuttering or enuresis, bedwetting. These stories are not just medical records, they are testimonies of colonial brutality, a way to document what history books might ignore. 5. Healing as part of liberation. Fanon argues that national liberation movements must address the psychological reconstruction of society. It is not enough to change political structures. The wounds of colonialism run deep in the psyche and must be treated. True liberation requires mental, cultural, and social healing alongside independence. This chapter prepares the reader for Fanon's conclusion, where he calls for a new humanism that transcends colonial divisions. Having shown that colonialism damages the mind, body, culture, and politics of societies, Fanon insists that decolonization must not simply reproduce the colonial order in new forms. Instead, it must create something radically different, a world where humanity is rebuilt on justice, dignity, and equality. Flow of the argument across the book. Chapter 1. Violence is the inevitable starting point of decolonization. Chapter 2. Spontaneity inspires revolt, but needs structured leadership. Chapter 3. National consciousness can collapse into elitism if disconnected from the people. Chapter 4. True culture is forged in resistance, not nostalgia. Chapter 5. Colonial violence leaves deep mental scars that must be healed in liberation. Fanon ends not with despair, but with a challenge: to build a world where liberation means healing, dignity, and renewal. If you want to keep uncovering Africa's revolutionary thinkers, untold histories, and cultural legacies, subscribe to AfriFacts on YouTube. Together, we can reclaim the stories and knowledge that continue to inspire freedom struggles today. Conclusion of The Wretched of the Earth. Detailed summary. After 5 chapters dissecting the violence, pitfalls, culture, and psychological costs of colonialism, Fanon ends with a bold, urgent reflection. His conclusion is not merely a summary, but a call for a new vision of humanity. 1. The failure of Europe. Fanon begins by criticizing Europe, the cradle of colonialism. He argues that European humanism was a lie, exposed by centuries of conquest, slavery, racism, and exploitation. Europe, he says, is morally bankrupt. It cannot be the model for newly independent nations. For Fanon, colonized peoples must resist the temptation to imitate Europe, its consumerism, capitalism, and hierarchies, because doing so only reproduces oppression in a new form. 2. A new beginning. Decolonization, Fanon insists, must be more than just replacing white rulers with black or brown elites. It must be a radical new beginning, where societies are rebuilt around justice, equality, and solidarity. He urges newly independent nations to reject both colonial capitalism and Soviet-style bureaucratic communism, arguing instead for a path rooted in the real needs of their people. 3. Centering the people. Fanon's consistent theme reappears: the people. The peasants, the workers, the poor must remain at the center of politics. Independence cannot be the project of elites. It must be grounded in the participation and empowerment of the masses. Liberation movements must focus on food, housing, education, health, and dignity, rather than prestige projects or elite wealth. 4. A global humanism. Fanon expands beyond Africa. The struggle of colonized peoples is part of a worldwide revolution. He envisions a new form of humanism, not Eurocentric, but global, where all nations contribute to building a just, cooperative future. In this vision, liberation is not just for Africans or Algerians, but for all oppressed peoples seeking dignity. Fanon's final call. The conclusion reads like both a warning and an invitation. If colonized nations follow Europe's path, they risk new forms of domination, corruption, and misery. But if they trust in their people, embrace radical change, and resist mimicry, they can create a new world. Fanon's final words echo like a rallying cry. Humanity is waiting for something new from the formerly colonized. The full arc of the book. 1. On violence. Decolonization begins with violence that breaks colonial power. 2. Spontaneity. Revolts must be guided into sustained political struggle. 3. National consciousness. Independence risks being betrayed by corrupt elites. 4. National culture. Liberation reshapes culture, not as nostalgia, but as living resistance. 5. Mental disorders. Colonialism leaves deep psychological wounds that must be healed. Conclusion. The colonized must reject Europe's model and build a new humanism rooted in dignity and justice. Fanon's conclusion is timeless. He challenges us not just to overthrow systems, but to imagine and build a new humanity. If you want to keep exploring the thinkers, histories, and cultural forces that shaped Africa and the world, subscribe to AfriFacts on YouTube. Let's keep learning, questioning, and reimagining together. Because, as Fanon reminds us, the future is ours to create.